2 years ago, I discovered that my wife, Karen, had been having an affair. The revelation came as a brutal shock, tearing apart everything I thought I knew about my marriage. There was a confrontation, a heated, vicious argument where every word felt like it could be the last. After hours of accusations and anger, I packed my bags and left, knowing I couldn't continue living with someone who betrayed me so deeply. For me, our marriage was over the second she let another man into her life. I checked into a modest motel not far from my office. It wasn't much, run down, the paint peeling on the walls, and a strange smell lingering in the hallways. But it would do until I found something more permanent. I dropped my 2 hastily packed suitcases on the bed and walked to a nearby bar. I was determined to drink away the ache in my chest, to drown out the swirling mess in my head. The bar was quiet, almost deserted, which suited me fine. It was a Tuesday night, and there were just a couple of patrons scattered at the tables and a lone older man nursing a beer at the bar. I found a booth in the back corner and signaled to the bored-looking waitress. I ordered a shot of bourbon and a beer, then downed them in quick succession. I sat back, waiting for the alcohol to blur the sharp edges of my thoughts. After a few rounds, I started thinking more clearly, or at least, I was able to sort through my situation without the sharp sting of betrayal overpowering me. I realized I had 2 choices. I could sit here, wallowing in self-pity, or I could get up and take action. I wasn't the kind of man to let things slide, whether in my work or personal life. I was a home builder, specializing in upscale custom homes, and I had a reputation to uphold. When a project had issues, I tackled them immediately, knowing that delays could cost me thousands. This situation, painful as it was no different. I left the bar and returned to the motel, managing a fitful night of sleep. The next morning, my mind was already in problem-solving mode. The first thing I did was head to the bank. I transferred all the money from our joint accounts into a personal account in my name, making sure that Karen wouldn't have access to it. I then canceled every joint credit card, keeping only the ones that were solely under my name, along with those associated with my business. By the time I was finished, I felt the smallest hint of relief, knowing I'd taken a step to protect myself. My last stop of the day was at my lawyer's office. Barry, my lawyer and a good friend, greeted me with genuine concern when I walked in. Although Barry specialized in real estate law, his wife and law partner, Rebecca, handled family cases. Together, they sat me down, listening as I poured out the details of my crumbling marriage. They didn't ask unnecessary questions or offer platitudes. I could see the sympathy in their eyes, but they knew me well enough to understand I didn't need pity, just a way out. This is a community property state, Barry reminded me, his voice calm but firm. Karen's entitled to half of everything you own, and you'll likely be responsible for some form of support. I know, I replied, trying to keep the bitterness out of my voice, but I'm not going to change my mind. Draw up the papers. I just want out. We talked through the details, and I filed for divorce on the grounds of irreconcilable differences rather than naming adultery. I did it for my daughter, Ella, who was 13. I didn't want her involved in the sordid details. That night, for the first time in days, I slept better. Knowing I was taking control gave me a sense of peace, however fleeting. It was Thursday evening, just 2 days since I'd walked out, when I received a call that would complicate everything. It was Ella, her voice trembling as she told me she was alone. Karen hadn't come home, and she was scared and hungry. Swearing under my breath, I jumped into my truck and drove straight home. I did my best to reassure Ella, to calm her down. After a few hugs and comforting words, I got her settled at the kitchen table and prepared her a simple meal. When I opened the fridge to grab something, I noticed an envelope pinned under a magnet. It had my name on it, written in Karen's familiar script. For a moment, I just stared at it, wondering what on earth it could say. But I set it aside to focus on Ella, promising myself I'd read it later when I was alone. After Ella had eaten and was tucked into bed, I sat down in the den, poured myself a shot of bourbon, and picked up the envelope. Inside was a note from Karen. It was brief and painfully cold. "If you think you can stick me with raising a child, you're out of your mind," she'd written. "Don't bother looking for me." My stomach twisted as I read those words, each one tearing at me. I couldn't believe it. How could a mother abandon her child so easily? Ella had always looked up to her, trusted her. And now, Karen had thrown all of that away. I climbed the stairs to our old bedroom and saw that most of her clothes and personal belongings were gone. She packed up and left, just like that. The next morning, I called Barry and Rebecca to explain what had happened. After hearing the latest development, Rebecca advised me to file a missing persons report. With Karen gone for over 48 hours, she said the police would have to take it seriously. But I knew that nothing would be easy from here on out. On Monday morning, I took Ella to school, doing my best to put on a brave face for her. After dropping her off, I drove to Karen's workplace, where I met up with Rebecca. We walked in together and asked if Karen was around. At the mention of her name, the receptionist gave us a concerned look and directed us to the Human Resources office. There, we learned that both Karen and her boss had turned in their resignations on Wednesday, the day after I had left. Somehow, I wasn't entirely surprised. I'd known for a while that her boss was the one she'd been involved with. He had foolishly risked his career by engaging in a relationship with her, and I figured he'd resign to avoid any fallout if I decided to make the affair public. Rebecca and I left the office building and headed out to the parking lot. She advised me to go to the police and file the missing persons report as planned, especially now that we knew Karen hadn't just left our home. She'd vanished from her job and seemingly her entire life in this town. Following her advice, I drove to the police station, where a detective took my statement. I was upfront with him, explaining that I wanted to find Karen mainly to serve her with divorce papers. I showed him the note she'd left behind and told him about her relationship with her boss. He took down all the information, then asked if I could account for my whereabouts on the day she disappeared. I assured him that I'd been on site at one of the houses I was building, with several contractors who could verify my presence. Before I left, the detective made it clear that if they determined she'd left on her own without foul play, there was little they could do. Still, he agreed to look into it, though he warned me not to expect much. After leaving the station, I took Rebecca out for lunch. We discussed the divorce proceedings and how we'd proceed if Karen remained missing. If she wasn't located, Rebecca explained that I'd have to wait a full year to file for divorce on the grounds of abandonment. My only other option would be to hire a private investigator, but something told me I wasn't ready to take that step. Honestly, I wasn't sure if I even wanted to know where she'd gone. A year seemed like a long time to wait, but as long as I didn't have to face her again, I could live with it. After lunch, I headed to one of my job sites to check on the progress. It felt good to focus on something familiar and productive after the chaos of the past few days. When Ella's school day ended, I was already there waiting for her in the parking lot. The moment she spotted my truck, she ran to me, her face etched with relief. She threw her arms around me, her voice muffled against my shoulder as she said, "I was afraid you wouldn't be here." I hugged her tightly, feeling a surge of anger toward Karen for putting her through this. "Don't worry, baby. I'm not going anywhere," I promised, my voice steady. "Do you really promise?" she asked, her big brown eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I really promise," I said, kissing her forehead. Ella clung to me the entire ride home, and even after we'd settled in, she refused to let me out of her sight. Over the following days, she began to have nightmares. Most nights, I'd be woken by her soft sobs, and I'd rush to her room to find her shaking and crying. When I held her and asked her what she'd been dreaming about, she whispered, "I was lost, and I couldn't find you or Mom." Her words broke my heart. It was around this time that I realized Ella and I would need more support than I could provide on my own. My office manager, Laura, suggested that I find a therapist for Ella. Laura had been a rock for me during all this, managing work-related tasks, filing permits, handling inspections, and making sure the business ran smoothly while I tried to keep my personal life from crumbling. When she proposed therapy, I knew she was right. Together, Laura and I researched therapists and found someone who specialized in working with adolescents. I chose a female therapist, Dr. Harper, hoping Ella would feel more comfortable. After meeting with Dr. Harper to explain our situation, she suggested starting with twice-weekly sessions. Some would be one-on-one with Ella, while others would include me, so we could work through things together. I was grateful to find someone who seemed so genuinely invested in helping us heal. Shortly after we began therapy, The police sent over a woman detective to speak with Ella. She gently asked about the last time Ella had seen her mother, and Ella described how Karen had seemed distracted that last morning before school. The detective took notes, but when she left, I sensed it was more a formality than anything that would lead to real answers. About a week later, I was called back to the station. The detective informed me that they'd tracked Karen's lover's credit card transactions to 2 motels, and security footage confirmed that they'd checked in together voluntarily. They'd left the state, and with no evidence of foul play, the police had no plans to continue their search. That was the last I heard from them regarding Karen's whereabouts. The next 2 months were a blur. Therapy seemed to help Ella understand that her mother's departure wasn't her fault, and she began to trust that I would always be there for her. The nightmares gradually lessened, though she still had moments where she clung to me for reassurance. Laura and her husband started inviting Ella and me over for barbecues on weekends. At first, I was hesitant, worried it might complicate things. But Laura convinced me that it would be good for Ella to spend time with her daughter, Sofia, who was the same age. Soon enough, our families started spending more and more time together, and Ella and Sofia quickly became close friends. Laura, a loving mother, went out of her way to include Ella in activities with her daughter, offering the kind of motherly guidance that Ella had been missing. Her warmth and kindness provided Ella with a sense of stability that I was incredibly grateful for. Karen had been gone for nearly 3 months when I decided it was time to clear out her belongings from the house. As I emptied her drawers, I came across a small, hidden box tucked in the back. Inside, I found some items that hinted at a side of her life I'd never known. Substances and materials that raised serious concerns about the choices she'd been making. I felt a surge of anger and disbelief, realizing that her lifestyle had shifted to something that didn't align with our values and commitment as a family. Alongside these items was a CD. Driven by curiosity, I loaded it into my computer to see what it contained. Within seconds, I recognized my own basement on the screen, with Karen and a group of people gathered around, engaging in activities that left me stunned. I skipped forward, but the further I went, the worse the scenes became. My stomach churned, and I rushed to the bathroom, overwhelmed by shock. Once I managed to compose myself, I shut off the video, took a deep breath, and called Rebecca. I explained what I'd found, and she advised me to avoid reporting the items, since it would ultimately come down to my word against Karen's. Instead, she encouraged me to store the video in a secure place, as it could become vital evidence in the future, particularly if there were ever a custody dispute involving Ella. It took all my willpower to keep myself from destroying the CD. But if keeping it meant protecting Ella, I knew it was a necessary step. A few weeks after discovering the CD, I was at another weekend barbecue with Laura, her husband Mike, and our daughters when Mike pulled me aside. He noticed I seemed tense and asked if everything was okay. After a bit of hesitation, I confided in him about Karen's hidden stash and the video I'd found. Mike's eyes widened with shock as I recounted what I'd seen. I finished by saying, "I guess I never really knew who Karen was." Mike put a hand on my shoulder and said, "You don't know how lucky you are to have someone like Laura around. She's as solid as they come." He wasn't wrong. Laura had been my pillar through the turmoil, and seeing her with Ella made me realize what a compassionate, steady influence she was. She'd helped me set up Ella's therapy and checked in on us both constantly. She had become more than just my office manager. She was a friend I could trust without question. I'd noticed how she spent time with both girls, giving Ella the kind of nurturing that I struggled to provide on my own. She was, simply put, a godsend. Despite our friendship, though, I'd always been respectful of her marriage. Laura loved her husband deeply, and even if things were different, I'd never make a move on a married woman. My loyalty to Mike, along with the pain Karen had inflicted on me, only solidified my resolve never to betray someone's trust that way. The idea of trying to steal another man's partner went against everything I believed in. However, the effect of Karen's betrayal ran deeper than I'd initially realized. When I brought up the CD at a follow-up meeting with Dr. Harper, she suggested we meet privately. She'd picked up on something in my demeanor, and I soon found myself in individual sessions with her. It took months for me to confront my feelings honestly, feelings I'd suppressed to keep going for Ella's sake. Dr. Harper helped me recognize the anger and grief I hadn't allowed myself to feel fully. In time, I learned to accept them, and slowly, I began to heal. A year passed, and, true to Rebecca's guidance, I was able to officially file for divorce on the grounds of abandonment. With no word from Karen and no effort on her part to contact Ella, the court granted the divorce and awarded me sole custody of my daughter. Rebecca advised that we didn't need to submit the CD as evidence. Karen's abandonment alone justified the decision. Still, I kept the CD hidden, a safeguard against any future attempt she might make to disrupt Ella's life. Finally, things began to settle into a new kind of normal. Ella's nightmares became less frequent, and she started smiling more, finding joy in small things again. Laura continued to invite us over, and we eventually began spending nearly every weekend with their family. Ella and Sofia were practically inseparable, and they spent hours chatting, sharing secrets, and laughing. It was as though Ella had found a sister in Sofia, and for that, I was grateful. Then, in a cruel twist, tragedy struck once again. Mike was an avid runner and cyclist, often competing in local races. During one of these races, he collided with another cyclist, and while his injuries seemed minor at first, a bad bruise on his thigh, none of us could have anticipated what would happen next. Unbeknownst to him or anyone else, a blood clot had developed, and within days, it broke free and caused a massive stroke. The call came while Laura and I were at work. I heard her phone ring, and then a sharp, strangled gasp. She looked at me, her face white with fear. "It's Mike," she managed to say. "He's been rushed to the hospital." Without a second thought, I grabbed my keys and led her to my truck. I drove her to the hospital in silence, glancing over occasionally to see her staring out the window, her hands shaking as she held her phone tightly. When we arrived, Laura raced into the emergency room, and I followed, trying to offer as much support as I could. After some time, a nurse told us that Mike was in critical condition. I led Laura to a quiet corner where we could sit, hoping to ease her anguish, if only slightly. I quickly realized it was nearing the time to pick up our daughters from school, so I called Rebecca and explained the situation. She agreed to collect both Ella and Sofia and bring them to the hospital. When they arrived, I met them outside and took a moment to speak to Sofia. I explained gently that her father had been in an accident and that the doctors were doing everything they could to help him. Sofia tried her best to be brave, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She gave a quick, determined nod, and we went back inside together to be with Laura. For the next several hours, we waited, taking turns comforting Sofia and Laura as best we could. That evening, after hours of tense silence, the doctors informed us that Mike had been moved to the ICU. His condition was grave, and he was being kept alive by life support. Laura fell into my arms, sobbing, while Sofia clung to Ella, both girls crying silently. As the hours wore on, Laura and Sofia sat by Mike's bedside, holding his hand and whispering words of love, even as he remained unresponsive. I stayed in the waiting area with Ella, making sure she was okay. Eventually, I had to take the girls home for the night, leaving Laura and Sofia at the hospital. Ella didn't want to leave her friend's side, and even as we arrived home, she held on to me tightly, clearly shaken. The next morning, before dawn, my phone rang. I knew, even before I answered, what it would be. Laura's voice, choked with sorrow, confirmed my fear. "Mark, Mike passed away," she said, her words barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry, Laura," I managed, but words felt meaningless in the face of such a loss. She needed her family, her friends, her community, whatever we could offer her in this dark moment. I woke Ella gently and explained what had happened. Tears filled her eyes, and she nodded, already understanding the depth of Sophia's pain. I asked Ella to help Sofia when we reached the hospital and assured her I'd be there for Laura. When we arrived, Sofia collapsed into Laura's arms, both of them consumed by grief. Ella stayed close, offering the comfort of a friend who knew the pain of loss. I took charge of arrangements, coordinating with the hospital and handling all the calls Laura couldn't bear to make. With Rebecca's help, we organized the funeral, which took place the following Monday. It was a somber event, attended by family, friends, and many of my colleagues, who wanted to pay their respects to a man they respected and admired. Laura's parents stayed with her and Sofia for the first few days, providing a much-needed support system. I gave her the space to grieve, but remained nearby, checking in every day to see if she needed anything. I handled whatever I could, wanting to ease her burden in any way possible. Seeing her go through this reminded me of my own struggles after Karen had left, and I resolved to be there for her as she had been for Ella and me. In the weeks following Mike's passing, I made a point of stopping by Laura's house regularly to check on her and Sofia. Ella often came with me, and the two girls grew closer, supporting each other as they navigated their grief. Laura and I spoke often about anything and everything, how she was holding up, memories of Mike, and even the little, mundane details of our day-to-day lives that reminded us life had to go on. One Monday, about 2 weeks after the funeral, I arrived at work to find Laura already seated at her desk. She looked up with a faint smile. "Well, boss," she said, a bit of her old spark back in her eyes. "Are you going to tell me everything you messed up while I was gone so I can fix it?" I couldn't help but smile. "Does this mean you're staying?" I asked cautiously. She nodded, her smile soft but resolute. "This is home for Sofia and me. I don't want to uproot her, and besides," she said, glancing around the office, "I have a business to run. Who else would keep you in line?" For the first time since Mike's death, I felt the weight in my chest lighten. We spent the rest of the morning catching up on work, falling back into our comfortable rhythm. I knew how difficult this decision must have been for her, but I respected her even more for her strength. I realized just how much I'd come to rely on Laura, not just as a friend, but as a part of my life. The following year was a whirlwind of school events, sports games, and weekend gatherings. Ella and Sofia's friendship only grew stronger, and as they entered their teenage years, they leaned on each other in a way that made me grateful every day. Laura became a second mother to Ella, and Sofia began looking to me as a father figure. They were good kids, so good, in fact, that it was hard for me to ever say no to them. Laura often stepped in as the disciplinarian, laughing at my tendency to give in to their every whim. Over time, Laura and I grew closer, our bond strengthening with each shared moment. We spent nearly every weekend together, usually at my house. I didn't want her sitting alone at home, and neither of us seemed to mind the arrangement. We talked about everything, from the girls' grades to work projects, to memories from our past lives. I never felt like I had to hold back with her, and for the first time in years, I felt a connection that went beyond friendship. One Saturday, about a year after Mike's passing, I returned home from a job site to find Laura's car in my driveway. We'd planned a barbecue by the pool, and as I went to grab my swim trunks, I thought I'd quickly change in the downstairs bathroom. But as I opened the door, I found Laura standing there, her back to me, reaching for her swimsuit top. She was wearing just the bikini bottoms, and I froze, unable to look away. She gasped and crossed her arms over her chest, spinning around to face me, her cheeks flushed with surprise. I stammered, quickly closing the door and stepping away, embarrassed. For the next 10 minutes, I tried to shake off the image that had burned itself into my mind. When she came out, fully dressed in her bikini, she could see the embarrassment written all over my face. "Mark, relax," she said with a laugh, touching my shoulder. "I know you didn't mean to walk in on me. Don't worry about it." Her laughter eased my nerves, and I was relieved she wasn't upset. We moved past the awkwardness, setting up the barbecue and settling into a casual conversation while the girls splashed around in the pool. But as the day went on, I caught myself sneaking glances at her, unable to ignore the newfound attraction I felt. When evening rolled around, the girls announced they were heading to Sofia's for a sleepover, leaving Laura and me alone. As she hugged me goodbye, she smiled warmly, and for a brief second, I felt the impulse to hold her closer. I brushed it off, unsure what to make of my feelings. Later that night, as I lay in bed, my thoughts drifted back to Laura. It had been a long time since I'd felt this way about anyone, but she wasn't just anyone. She was my friend, my confidant, and the mother of my daughter's best friend. I didn't want to jeopardize that. Still, the thought lingered. The next Saturday, after dropping the girls off at a week-long sports camp, I took Laura as my guest to the annual Builders Association Awards dinner. We hadn't had an evening out together like this, and I couldn't help but be nervous. When I arrived at her house to pick her up, she opened the door in an elegant black dress, simple yet stunning, and my breath caught. She looked beautiful, and my admiration must have been obvious, as she gave me a shy smile, saying, "You clean up pretty well yourself?" At the dinner, we sat with other builders and their spouses, making small talk and discussing business. When they announced the award for quality of craftsmanship, I was surprised to hear my name. I stood up, looking over at Laura, who beamed with pride, clapping louder than anyone in the room. When I accepted the award, I couldn't help but give her credit. "I owe this to my incredible office manager, Laura," I said, glancing down at her. "She keeps everything running, and I wouldn't be here without her." When I returned to the table, Laura hugged me tightly, her eyes glistening with tears. Then, she surprised me with a quick, gentle kiss on the lips, a friendly gesture, but one that left my heart pounding. When the music began, I asked her to dance, and she took my hand, leading me to the floor. We started with an upbeat song, laughing as we moved clumsily through the steps. But when a slow song followed, Laura wrapped her arms around my neck, and I instinctively pulled her close. It had been years since I'd held someone like this, and I felt a warmth spread through me, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt since before Karen left. For those few minutes, everything else faded away, and it was just us, swaying together under the soft glow of the lights. When the song ended, we returned to our seats, and I felt a quiet, unfamiliar joy settle over me. On the drive home, Laura suggested we end the evening with a soak in the hot tub at my place. I agreed, thankful for an excuse to spend more time with her. I changed quickly, heating the tub and grabbing a bottle of wine before she joined me outside. For a while, we sat in comfortable silence, savoring the warm water and the peaceful night air. Eventually, Laura broke the silence. "Mark, it's been over 2 years since Karen left. Have you thought about being with someone again?" Her question caught me off guard, but I answered honestly. Honestly, I hadn't thought about it until recently. "Recently?" she asked, a hint of curiosity in her eyes. "Well, maybe someone made me start thinking about it," I said, my voice faltering as I met her gaze. She gave me a knowing smile, setting her glass aside and leaning closer. "Was it someone in particular?" I swallowed, feeling the pull of her presence more strongly than ever. "Yes." With that, Laura moved closer, her eyes searching mine. The world seemed to stand still as she straddled my lap, her arms wrapping around my neck. Our lips met in a slow, tender kiss, a release of the feelings we've both been holding back. For the first time in years, I let myself be vulnerable, letting down the walls I'd built around my heart. That night, we shared an intimacy that felt natural, inevitable. It was more than just passion. It was the culmination of trust, friendship, and a deep bond that had grown over time. As dawn broke, I woke with her beside me, her head resting on my shoulder. She stirred, smiling as she looked up at me. "Good morning, beautiful," I whispered, feeling an unfamiliar contentment settle over me. She laughed softly, snuggling closer. "Good morning, handsome." For the first time, I felt whole again, and as the days passed, I realized that what I had with Laura went beyond anything I could have anticipated. Our connection felt effortless, like it was always meant to be. 2 weeks later, when it was time to pick up the girls from camp, we decided it was time to be open with them about our relationship. We'd take things one step at a time, but we wanted to make sure Ella and Sofia felt comfortable and supported. As we drove home, listening to the girls chatter about their time at camp, I glanced over at Laura, feeling a sense of rightness I hadn't known was possible. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew we'd face them together as a family. Back at home, the girls were still full of energy, recounting their camp experiences in excited bursts. After we settled in, Laura and I exchanged a glance, silently agreeing it was time to talk to them. I cleared my throat, feeling an odd mix of nerves and anticipation. "Ella, Sofia," I began, catching their attention. "Laura and I have something we'd like to share with you." They looked at us, curiosity written across their faces. Laura took my hand, her warmth grounding me. "We've grown very close over the past year," she continued, her voice calm and steady. "And well, we've realized that we care for each other very deeply. Mark and I are in love." For a moment, There was silence as the girls processed this. Then, almost in unison, their faces broke into wide smiles. Sofia looked at me with excitement. "So, you're going to be like boyfriend and girlfriend?" she asked, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "Something like that," I replied, chuckling. "We're taking it slow, but we wanted to know how you both feel about it." Ella leaned forward, her eyes bright. "Does this mean Laura and Sofia might move in with us someday?" she asked eagerly. Laura and I exchanged a glance, smiling. "Yes," Laura answered softly. "That's the plan, if that's okay with both of you." The girl's reaction was more enthusiastic than I could have hoped for. Ella squealed and threw her arms around Sofia, and then they both hugged Laura and me. "This is going to be amazing," Ella exclaimed, her happiness spilling over. Sofia grinned, nodding in agreement. "It already feels like we're sisters." Hearing her say that made my heart swell. I held them close, overwhelmed by gratitude and relief. The joy on their faces was infectious, and in that moment, I knew we'd made the right decision. Over the next few months, Laura and Sofia slowly moved into our home, blending our lives together. Laura put her house on the market, and with the proceeds, we started college funds for the girls, ensuring they'd have a solid foundation for the future. Our home became a lively hub of activity, filled with laughter, shared meals, and late-night conversations. Laura and I continued balancing work and family life, supporting each other through every small triumph and challenge. Ella and Sofia quickly settled into their new lives as sisters. They worked on school projects together, shared inside jokes, and leaned on each other in ways that showed me just how deeply their bond had grown. Watching them together was a gift, a reminder of how far we'd all come since those early, uncertain days. One evening, about 6 months after Laura and Sofia moved in, I decided to make everything official. I took Laura out to a quiet dinner, just the two of us, letting the girls spend the evening with friends. Afterward, we took a walk along the pier, the city lights reflecting off the water. I stopped, turning to her and taking both her hands in mine. "Laura," I began, my voice soft but steady. "You've brought so much light into my life. You've been my best friend, my partner, and I can't imagine my life without you. Will you marry me?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, her smile brighter than I'd ever seen. "Yes, Mark," she whispered. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." We sealed our promise with a kiss, and in that moment, I felt like I'd finally come home. Our wedding was simple but filled with love. Ella was my proud flower girl, and Sofia stood by Laura's side as her maid of honor. Our closest friends and family were there, including Rebecca and Barry, along with a few of my trusted colleagues and their families. The joy and warmth of the day felt like a new beginning, not just for Laura and me, but for our entire family. We honeymooned in Fiji, exploring the islands by day and basking in each other's company by night. Returning home, we were welcomed by Ella and Sofia with a homemade welcome home banner and flowers from the garden. That evening, we shared stories from our trip, laughter echoing through the house as the girls listened, wide-eyed and fascinated. From that day forward, we embraced life as a complete family. We attended every school event, every sports game, and supported the girls through the challenges of growing up. The bond between us only grew stronger with time, and eventually, both Ella and Sofia began calling me Dad and Laura Mom without hesitation. It was a title I didn't take for granted, knowing how much it meant to them and to us. 1 year later, on our first anniversary as a family, we took the girls to the same pier where I proposed. We stood together, watching the sunset over the water, reminiscing about the journey that had brought us here. We shared our hopes for the future and the promise of a life filled with love, laughter, and all the joys that come with being a family. As I looked around at the three people who meant everything to me, I knew that the heartbreak and loss we'd all endured had been transformed into something extraordinary. We had found each other, and together, we had built a new life. One filled with love, trust, and the kind of happiness that I knew would last a lifetime. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories on the channel.